Donald Trump and some judges have some differing opinions on who is controlling who gets deported and how they get deported and the process by which all this happens and who's right. I guess Trump is right, but let's let the courts play themselves out, and you may like the result you get if you go through the whole process anyway. But to put a little more depth on it, Susham M's back on the James Show. Welcome back, sir. He's an immigration. Are you an immigration attorney or just immigration advocate?
Yeah, I'm an immigration attorney, practiced almost 15 years. I was also a law professor before as well.
Fantastic. All right, so tell me what I need to know about the case here where this judge has found probable cause to hold the Trump administration in contempt for violating a deportation order. Explain.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, what this hinges around is Mr. Kilmar Garcia. So what he had approved was something called withholding of removal, which is a protection against deportation. What it is, actually, in some ways, it's more difficult to get than asylum, which means that a court in a full trial has found that more than likely he would be persecuted or tortured if he was returned to his home country. So he was actually afraid of gangs, is what a full trial has found. And then under something called the Alien Enemies Act, which was instituted in 1798, the last time it was used before the Trump administration was in World War II against the Japanese concentration camps. And so President Trump invoked that law on a weekend, on a Sunday night, I believe, and Mr. Garcia was removed without even a court hearing or anything, despite that protection he had. But the issue here is he was deported without seeing a judge, and he had withholding of removal. And when he was deported in the middle of the flight that was happening, he was in international seas, a judge, a federal judge, issued that plane to be returned back to the US. And the government still removed him to El Salvador. And so what that federal judge recently found was that he's looking into reasonably finding that the government be held in contempt for violating his order. And then that's what's been proceeding since. So an appellate court recently kind of put that on hold, just gave the government more time to have response arguments. And so that's what's developing through the litigation.
So I've seen critics of this order say there's some random judge who's not even in the chain of authority here who's trying to overstep his jurisdiction, and he has no say-so over these deportations. That's strictly the jurisdiction of the executive branch, which is headed by Donald Trump.
That's an excellent question as well. It's actually, so just to take a step back, before we talk about this 1798 law that President Trump is trying to invoke again, before this law was invoked, which, by the way, has only been invoked during a declaration of war, which arguably we're not in. But before this was invoked, anybody who was put in, like most people who are put in deportation, they have a right to an immigration court hearing. So like a due process, to be able to argue their case about like if they're afraid to go back, like Mr. Garcia was, like if they would get tortured or persecuted. So they have a right, like a due process right. This law is a very rarely used law. I mean, last time it was used is World War II. And it gives the president more rights to deport people without a court hearing, but only under very limited circumstances. So when there's a declaration of war, for example, and also, and this is maybe the clearest reason that it's probably unlawful. I mean, there's several, but another reason is it has to usually, the law says the Alien Enemies Act was passed by Congress in 1798, and the law gives the president authority to not have that normal channel of immigration court proceedings when there's not only a declaration of war, but that declaration of war has to be against a nation or government. So President Trump is trying to use it against, what he deems gangs. And by the way, Mr. Garcia was never convicted of any, criminal gang membership.
Well, we also have sort of the duplicitous language of Congress over here, where, you know, we haven't really declared an official war like in stark terms since World War II, but they will have an authorization for the use of military force that Congress passes through the House and Senate and gets signed by the president. And doesn't that sort of de facto count as the same thing as a declaration of war, even though it doesn't say declaration of war in the title? And this is a layman's question, so this might sound dumb to a lawyer, but I mean, I've always found that confusing.
No, another excellent question, actually. The president does have emergency wartime powers, but a formal declaration of war is only done by Congress. And so that's one issue with the Alien Enemies Act. But even if we were to pass that, because you are correct, the executive branch gets more deference during declarations of war or foreign adversaries. So one issue is we're probably not in a war, but even if we were, because the president gets more deference, that war has to be against a nation or government. It can't be
against the ethereal concept of terrorism, because that's something else. Like I said, the duplicitous language, we're in a war on terror. And so then anyone we declare as a terrorist group, I guess we're now at war with these people too. And so I just, that is kind of a sneaky expansion of powers. Not that deporting the guy I think is wrong. It's probably best for America if we deport criminals or people who have shown to be criminals or associated with gangs or any illegal, really. But yeah, I've always found that legal gray area kind of uncomfortable.
Yeah, actually 2 points to that. I mean, one, exactly correct. There can be a huge slippery slope here because the expansion powers of just deeming anybody a terrorist that we don't like, and that we're therefore in a war against them and can just be quickly deported without seeing a judge is quite scary. The second thing is, even if it was against criminals, Mr. Garcia has never been convicted of a crime. So that's another scary thing. The Trump administration is using language of like a temporary emergency protective order, which is you don't even often get a hearing in front of not a criminal judge, but a family judge, like a civil action. And a full trial, as well as the Fourth Circuit, which is right one level below the Supreme Court, both found where they had a lot more evidence that there was tenuous or very flimsy evidence of him being connected to any gang membership. The only evidence was one anonymous informant. So imagine this. Imagine if you just don't like somebody and then you allege that they're part of a gang member and without any criminal conviction, criminal court hearing, any of that stuff, they can just be quickly deported, not to their home nation. I mean, you're correct that he's from El Salvador, but most of them were from Venezuela. And so then they can just be quickly deported to an El Salvadorian prison, which is incredibly harsh that we can all agree on. And without any due process, any rights, be there for a lifetime.
Well, I don't think he hasn't had any due process. He's been picked up and investigated and gone through the court process. He just didn't have an additional hearing once they changed the rules and designated MS-13 a terrorist organization. That undoes his protection that he had against being deported from the previous judge in 2021. And so he's gone through some due process, and there is paperwork that shows when he got arrested, there were two other guys that actually did have their crimes adjudicated and were shown to be part of MS-13. Those were the guys that said he was, and he does have like the tattoo of the skull with the eyes crossed out that seems to be associated with MS-13. So it's not like there's no evidence or there's no paperwork or no due process. They just skipped an additional hearing after they changed the rules and declared MS-13 a terrorist organization. That's my understanding.
Yeah, not exactly, though. When he had the due process, he had a full trial and he had the right to stay here with his U.S. citizen wife and daughter. When he didn't have the due process, like you're mentioning, this new rule that President Trump invoked, he was quickly deported with, at that time, no due process at all, just quickly deported without seeing a judge. And then when they finally got in front of a judge and he's in international waters, the judge ordered that the plane be turned around. It wasn't turned around.
Susham Modi, immigration attorney. How do we find your work online?
Yeah, it's the Modi Law Firm. So if you just go to www.themodilawfirm.com, you'll see us. And I taught this too. I taught asylum refugee law. So it's an honor to be part of your program to discuss something so important about people's lives. So I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it was a great chat. We'll do it again, Susham.
All right, sounds great. Have a good one. Thank you.